Sure, reality TV is not 100% real, and I don't know anybody who thinks that it is. But at the same time, I don't think that matters in terms of what it has to teach us about ourselves.
You're listening to Good is in the Details. I'm Gwendolyn Dolske. In this podcast episode, I'm going solo. Rudy is on holiday. This is the podcast where we learn what we didn't know in the spirit of Socrates, all with the aim of a happy life, a more knowledgeable life. We're going to use those critical thinking skills. That's what this podcast is about. And today we have author of the book, True Story, What Reality TV Says About Us, sociology professor Danielle Lindemann. Now, I first came across Danielle's work because I saw her quoted in a New York Times article that was talking about reality TV. And I have to confess, over the summer, been watching a little too much reality TV. I don't know how it happened, but it has happened and it has been a downward spiral. The more absurd and outrageous the show is, I have to see what's happening. And I've been keeping this all to myself. It turns out a lot of us do this. A lot of us do this. Maybe we feel a bit sheepish, like we're confessing something, but there is this draw to reality TV. So what is going on there? And what we have with this interview with Danielle, we're going to learn from a sociologist's lens what these shows are actually illustrating about the groups and the culture, ideas about beauty, about love, about marriage, about family, what these shows are actually at their core revealing about our own values. Now, just as an FYI, her book, True Story, What Reality TV Says About Us, and I'm going to link it in the show notes, has been listed by several publications as one of the top books to read in 2022. One of the top nonfiction reads. And I can tell you, when she sent me her book, I read it in less than 2 days. I was absolutely glued to it. It was such a fantastic analysis, and there were so many things about this genre of entertainment, if you will, that I had just been passively consuming, not realizing that there is a lot here to dissect. So again, we're going to tap into those critical thinking skills, learn about what these shows reveal about us. And just before we get started with our interview, I have some good news. Good is in the Details is nominated in the education category for Women in Podcasting Awards. And so I will link in the show notes, but you can put your vote for Good is in the Details. All you have to do is go to womeninpodcasting.net and cast your vote. Education category, Good is in the Details. Yeah, I'm excited. Okay, now let's talk about reality TV. I have to tell you, I'm also very interested in your book on dominatrix, but I know we're talking about reality TV today. You have delved into the most interesting topics.
Oh, I think so. Thanks.
Let's, for our audience, just a broad definition of what is sociology. So when we're talking about your work on reality TV and your observations, what is the lens that we're using exactly?
Sure. So sociology can be defined as the scientific study of people in groups. And those groups can be any size. So it could be, the smallest group, a group of 2 or a group of 3, up to like entire societies, entire countries. And that doesn't mean we ignore the individual. We do look at the individual, but it's always in relation to how is that individual shaped by the groups of which they're a part.
I always tell my students the fastest way to see how you are part of a group is when you travel, because then you see how much of your habits and way of viewing the world, speaking about the world, is really distinct to the group in which you grew up with.
Oh, that's so interesting. And that's such a good metaphor for reality TV. To, I guess, not to get ahead of ourselves, but takes people kind of out of their comfort zone and plunks them down in different social situations. And then you can really see the influence of their upbringing in shaping who they are now that they're in a different context.
Mm-hmm. I'm so excited about your book. I don't watch TV, really. And then I did watch a little bit of a new reality television show, and I was just so hooked. Like after, my daughter's in bed, then I turned that on and I was just binging. And then as I got your book and I'm reading through it, I realized I am familiar with nearly every single show that you are referencing. And I had to think back, when am I watching this? Because I don't normally watch TV. And I have over the years in binges. Like after a semester's over or I'm exhausted, then I'll do it in binges. And I don't really understand what it is that I'm watching or why it is that I am so fascinated by what is going on. So and I also love your work. Let me just put it this way. I have been fascinated by what is popular. So whenever something is really trending, I kind of want to figure out, wait a minute, why is this in the consciousness right now? And you have got that with reality TV, starting with The Real World with MTV, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's so interesting because so you actually do watch, but you watch in binges. But some people don't watch, but they still are familiar with everything going on reality TV because it is so popular, right? Because it's out there in the collective consciousness.
What is it? Like, what is it? Did reality TV start with The Real World and then everybody was saying, hey, we've really got something here, and then just took off with it? What was it that people were enjoying unfold before their eyes?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of people say it started with the real world. There's some people who say, well, it had its roots in documentary, which came before it, or the quiz shows and game shows that came before. But wherever it started, yeah, there is this, widespread public appeal to the genre. And, people tune in for a variety of reasons. And, it depends on the person and it depends on the show why they tune in. By and large, there's that kind of train wreck pull to it where you're
Yes.
watching to remind yourself that you're not of the train wreck. You can feel a little bit superior, right? Like, at least I might be messed up in my own ways, but at least I'm not like those people competing on The Bachelor over there. You kind of have to like pull over and watch. But at the same time, we're also drawn to the people who appear in those shows, right? There's always kind of some character or someone we can like grab onto and say, this person resonates with me, or this person is most like me in certain ways. So it's an interesting tension where we're kind of distancing ourselves from the people on those shows, but also we kind of see ourselves in the character, maybe in more kind of amped up form.
Yeah. And so when they have these casting calls and they choose people, my question is, it's kind of like a chicken and an egg. Are they putting people in front of the camera who fit an existing stereotype, or are they bringing people in to make us challenge our ideas about the stereotype or archetype
That's
of
a good
character?
question.
Like which
I mean, I
one is
can't
it?
speak to what's in their mind. I mean, other people who've written about the casting process seem to suggest that they are aware of those archetypes, right? We're going to cast the smart one, we're going to cast the hot one, and what have you. So I don't think there's a lot of evidence. Again, this is not my area of research. I mostly look at these shows kind of as text, right? Looking at what happens on the show and how that teaches us about ourselves. So I can't speak very well to what's happening in the casting director's mind, but everything I've read seems to suggest that they're kind of confirming our priors. They're like casting people that fit into these broad categorizations because these categorizations, these archetypes are familiar to us and they resonate with us.
I remember when The Bachelor came out, I watched the first season and still had in the back of my mind, I shouldn't be watching this. Like you mentioned, why is it a
Yeah.
guilty pleasure? Because it yields no result. And I'm like, I could be reading something that would enhance my mind. And yet I got to watch how this turns out. I think I watched the first season of The Bachelor and then The Bachelorette, all the while thinking this is ridiculous, but I keep watching it. And you talk about how these shows, in a way, confirm our ideas about marriage and family and love and gender roles. So, in what way do they do
Yeah.
that?
So it is interesting because you would expect these shows that have these kind of zany characters and outrageous premises to really kind of be pushing the envelope. But when it comes to their very core, they don't really, by and large, right? And of course, there are exceptions that I write about in the book. By and large, especially the mainstream network shows, don't really threaten our ideas about, what it means to be a man or means to be a woman or what it means to have a legitimate family or our pre-existing ideas about race or social class. So it is this interesting paradox where we would expect these shows to be, really cutting edge in a lot of ways, but in a lot of ways, they're really kind of retrogressive in the values that they impart.
Yeah, like, well, with The Bachelor or with The Real Housewives, I remember thinking to myself that these are enforcing these ideas of women hating each other all for getting a man, that the man is the prize. And that they're
Right, exactly.
reinforcing that. And then you also mentioned with the housewives, like there's this idea of being a woman's significance is still attached to the man she is married to. So his profession and his income makes her value go up.
Right, not just the housewives, but there are all these wives shows, basketball wives, baseball wives, right? Some of them aren't even wives. But this idea that, again, yeah, it's who they are. Is it by virtue of what male they're attached to? Yeah, and it does promulgate certain ideas about, women being catty, or even the way that they kind of perform their gender on a show like The Bachelor is in very kind of traditional ways, right? With the long hair, the eyelashes, faces full of makeup, the dresses. I think somebody wore like a jumpsuit one season and it was, scandalous. The one with short hair is very noticeable because they're the only one with short hair. So even in the way that they perform their gender, but then I also say, yeah, they're performing their gender in kind of almost dragged out, like really enhanced ways. But so are we in our everyday lives. We're performing gender every day, maybe in more muted ways.
Do women really fight over men? Like I'm just wondering, because that's what these shows they're about. Or I mean, like Bachelor and Housewives, I'm thinking about all the fighting over men and all of the gossiping. But it's just I don't know, it just seems so old. Like I think about the philosopher Mary Wollstonecraft, who wrote in the late 1700s A Vindication of the Rights of Women, and she was arguing for women to be educated. And in order for her to make that argument, she had to counter all of the existing ideas of women's quote unquote nature. And this is part of it, this idea of just trying to be pretty, just trying to be an object so that you can get the man. She's arguing all this stuff from the late 1700s. And then I turn on The Real Housewives and I'm like, oh my goodness, everything that Mary Wollstonecraft was saying that she was trying to argue against is being presented full force. I see that you've studied gender and sexuality. How is it that in the world we've made so much progress, but then for our entertainment value, we want to look at this super traditional old school stuff?
Well, first of all, I think that would make an amazing academic paper, Wollstonecraft on the Real Housewives. So if that has not been already written, at least one of us should get on that. I guess sociologists often look at kind of how things remain the same. So perhaps I suffer from that bias. And clearly, we've made progress since Wollstonecraft's day. Obviously, these women are able to be kind of more overt in their sexuality. They are, they're able to have careers, right? They're able to open a checking account without their husband's signature. Clearly, we've made progress. No one would say that we haven't. But in some ways, we haven't really made progress. Some of those same ideas about gender continue to lurk. And so I don't know. I think Real House, we might look at a show like The Real Housewives or The Bachelor and say, oh, this is so antiquated. But I mean, in reality, our ideas about gender continue to be antiquated in a lot of ways. We weren't even able to elect a female president, right? And people, not only that, but people, made very sexist comments. And now, right? Now, even now in politics, people are making sexist, racist comments. So it's hard to say like, oh, look how far we've come. Yes, clearly, objectively, we've come a long way. But, those kind of quote unquote traditional ideas about gender have not gone away.
No. And I mean, I'm in this pool. Like, I am not finger wagging. I am somebody who has studied feminist theory. I've written on Simone de Beauvoir, and yet I am glued to this television when these shows come on. Like I said, when I was reading your book, I was like, oh my goodness, I know all of these shows. Almost all of them. You had written about how ideas of race, like again, there's some progress, but there are people who are noticeably absent. Asian men, for instance, Latinx men, Black women, that there is this portrayal there that is, it's like, even though we've made headway, there's either this absence or there's this hyper stereotype that's being put out in front of us.
Right. I do think that in recent years, especially, post George Floyd, there is more of an awareness of the stereotyping, especially of Black people and Black women in reality TV. I sense that producers are trying to move away from that in kind of response to the audience's now response to this. But I mean, it remains to be seen whether that's actually going to make a long-term difference. But yeah, historically, reality TV has presented racial minorities, especially Black women, in really, really stereotyped ways. You know, the angry, finger-wagging Black woman. Although it is really nuanced too, because Black women are large audiences for these shows. And if you read, oftentimes female scholars of color, they'll say, well, it's nuanced because we can recognize that this is problematic, but at the same time, we're hungry for representation of any kind. And so we're happy to see people on the show who look like us, even if we can say these are problematic in some ways. I think there's a level of nuance to it. But yeah, I mean, in a lot of ways, the portrayals not only of Black women, but of Latinx women, of gay men, right? There's a lot of stereotypes. Stereotyping is the bread and butter of reality TV.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it really hit me when you said, or when you wrote about the absence of Asian men, because I was just racking my brains trying to find one of these love romance shows where you have an Asian man in there. And it's just holding on to an old school notion of desexualizing Asian men.
Oh, absolutely. And when they're there, and they're knocked out in round one.
Yeah. I also thought another group would be Middle Eastern or Arab American men. I don't think that they are in the picture at all, which says a lot about what our concept of love is, or who gets to fall in love, or whose story gets to be told.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I think there are a few shows on Broad, like Shaws of Sunset might fall into that category.
Okay.
But yeah, by and large, I mean, historically, reality TV has been a lot of like white people, right? Like white, 20-something, conventionally attractive, oftentimes straight people. And when people in other categories are there, oftentimes they're stereotyped.
There was something in the news recently about reality television, and I think that that's what actually made me pay attention. And I watched a season of Love is Blind, and then I came across a New York Times article where you were quoted. So I've kind of become obsessed with this notion of reality TV lately. And it's so funny because whenever I mention it to somebody else, it's almost kind of like in a hush, like, so I've been watching this show. I'm so interested. And the amount of people, other academics also, who have told me, yes, I do too. Like, there's no reason we need to be whispering about it. It's in the culture.
Yeah, welcome to my world.
The
I get a lot of confessions like
Yeah,
that.
the last two podcast episodes that we have done in the recording and the conversation were two other philosophy professors. And when I was saying what's coming up, which was with you, they said, oh yeah, I've seen this show or that show. And I thought, oh my gosh. But one of the things I told my students, I teach a philosophy of sex and love class. So when I was watching Love is Blind, I was telling them, some of my thoughts about it, about how it's, you're kind of guaranteed that the person on the other side is going to be good looking because they're only casting the same kind of standard of beauty. It would be more interesting if you switched up like clear signs of religion, or even if there is a disability or something like that. Like, also people with disabilities seem to be absent from this genre, unless you can tell me, unless I'm missing something there.
Oh, for sure. I mean, there's love on the spectrum, but yeah, I think that's absolutely true. Although I would worry about casting someone as with a disability on Love is Blind, because I could see that not going very well, and or them being tokenized. So, I mean, the problem is, like, on one hand, you want representation. On the other hand, right,
Don't
reality
exploit.
TV is all about stereotyping.
It's such a lucrative business. But I think the reason it had been in the news was for work, because now reality TV is so big that can be somebody's profession. And so there was this call to curb the amount of alcohol and the hypersexualization, because those were not good for the work conditions.
Yeah, that's so interesting to me, especially the response to that, right? Because it is work, right? Just from a, objective standpoint, people are being paid to appear on these shows, so it is labor. But people don't tend to see it as work. And so there's oftentimes not a lot of sympathy for the people who appear on reality shows. There's a sense that, oh, well, they knew what they were getting into, right? Reality TV's been on now, right, for, more than a quarter of a century. Clearly they know what they were getting into. And so that's very interesting to me. And I think that goes hand in hand with the kind of stigmatization of reality TV. Like, people don't take the genre seriously. It's this guilty pleasure. And so they don't really take it seriously as work, because they see it as people just being filmed, like going about about their everyday lives. And so even people who I've talked to who, are very staunch, like advocates for unions, right? Like workers' protections in other respects, kind of balk when it comes to reality TV because they see them as in some other class when just from an objective standpoint, right? They're performing labor, they're getting paid to perform labor. So wouldn't you want them to have the same protections that other people have? On the other hand, then what would happen to reality TV? It would look very different as a genre if, for instance, there were no excessive drinking.
Yeah, they're like sleep deprived and then they're given a bunch of alcohol and then whispered by a producer of, some sort of drama and then they just let loose and film. That's crazy to me.
Right.
Exactly. Because so we're sitting here watching it thinking these people are crazy, but actually if you were to put yourself in those work conditions, I don't know how it would turn out.
That is absolutely why I would never go in reality TV. Right, I know. And they're really, then they cast people with certain psychological profiles, right? And then they probe for those triggers. In some ways, it's almost like psychological torture. And yet people are sitting there saying, well, they knew what they were getting into, so I don't really feel sympathy for them, or I don't consider it labor. And there's also, people who they see themselves as like in the creative industries, like legitimate artists, right? Like people who, are actors, musicians, dancers, who would then look at people in reality TV and say, what they're doing is not art. What we're doing is art. So we should be the protected workers, right? They're just getting filmed to go about their lives.
So, the overarching idea of your book is that those things actually don't matter. What matters is the fact that we're drawn to them and why we're drawn to them. Because it's telling us about what it is that we like and how we identify and relate, right?
Right. Even the fact that we're drawn to shows, where women and men are performing their gender in such traditional ways, the fact that there's something appealing about that still demonstrates that we really haven't moved in some ways past these really like concrete notions about gender.
Yeah, you said something along the lines of that marriage is the standard. So in a lot of these love shows, when people say, well, are you here for the right reasons? Or we have a connection, that it's actually revealing to us how that two people coupling up or having marriage is still the gold standard. So even from, let's say, a more socially conservative mindset where this seems to be all over the place, it's actually holding on, retaining that idea.
What's fascinating to me about these dating shows, right? Because they talk about the right reasons as though those reasons are kind of ahistorical and universal, but those reasons are very specific to the social context in which we live. People are supposed to be getting married because they love each other, because they were struck by Cupid's bow, right? Because they were attracted to each other. But that historically, people have not always gotten married for those reasons. And initially, it was sort of this economic arrangement, right? And so when we say right reasons, well, it's like the right reasons for us right now, historically. Also the fact that, like the end result almost always is marriage, almost always heterosexual marriage, either the promise of it or actual marriage. And it doesn't matter how zany the premise is. Like they could be dating wearing prosthetic noses, they could be dating in underground bunkers. It doesn't matter. Ultimately, like what they need to be after, the right reason is usually heterosexual marriage. And that's fascinating to me because in some ways that doesn't reflect the world we live in, but in some ways it really reflects the continued importance that heterosexual marriage has over our lives.
You also wrote that the family dynamic is not in jeopardy, that would be another value that's really entrenched in these shows, even with the Kardashians. So people will say like how wild and materialistic, but that in these shows, the family is still the main unit.
Absolutely. There's a lot of kind of hysteria about, the family is less important. The family is crumbling. In some ways, families are less important to us than they once were, but they're still really, really important in our lives, right? The concept of the family is really here to stay. If you think about a thought experiment where we lived and existed not in families, I guess there have been a few examples of those over time, but they often fall apart, right? Because the family unit is whatever that looks like is still so important and core to our identities. And the Kardashians really show that. I can barely relate to the Kardashians in terms of how they live their everyday lives. But what they always come back to, right, is this idea of their relationships between each other, between the sisters, between the mother and daughter. And that's something that most of us can relate to.
I want to talk about another show that you mentioned, and I've seen maybe 2 or 3 episodes of it, and I really was fascinated by your take. And that's the show Undercover Boss. what you were talking about was revealing this idea of class and work through this show. You mentioned Marx's separation of the classes, right? The capital versus the laborer. I want to make sure that that's clear because sometimes, especially in today's political and cultural climate, once you reference Marx, then people seem to tune out. So in the broadest sense, what is it that we are saying about Marx's structure of work relationships? And then how is that revealed in Undercover Boss?
Yeah, so I'm familiar with people tuning out because I teach college students. But yeah, so like, Marx talks about, there's the proletariat who are kind of the worker bees and the bourgeoisie who own they're factory owners, right? And the proletariat are doing the manual labor and the bourgeoisie are more like the CEOs, right? And so an undercover boss, you have this boss, a member of the bourgeoisie who kind of goes undercover as a member of the proletariat in his or her own company. And so you can really see the separation between those two classes and the labor that they do. But I argue that what it really brings into focus is this idea that, how much money one earns is not necessarily completely aligned with how objectively important their work is. Although we tend to tell narratives that make it seem that way. If all the burger flippers in the world stop flipping burgers, I mean, is a burger flipper's work inherently less important than the CEO's work? It's hard to say. And I think we saw that during the pandemic too, which is something I talk about in the book, where, the people who were the essential workers were not necessarily the most highly compensated people. We're not the CEOs necessarily, right? They were people like, sanitation workers, grocery store stockers who needed to continue to work because their labor was seen as essential. So, as Marx pointed out, and we can still see in reality TV, it is this misalignment between the work that is objectively important and the work that is most well compensated. And we can even see that in a meta way with, reality TV stars, some of their bloated salaries, right? Like Kylie Jenner being paid $1 million for an Instagram post. People might say that's absurd. She doesn't deserve that. And maybe not, but this is nothing new, right? There's always, again, been this misalignment between what is objectively important for our society and how people are compensated.
Yeah, you wrote the commodity fetishism. So as us, the viewer, we're able to see that disconnect from the power, from the person in the suit and the actual labor that it takes to create the product that we are all consuming.
Right. It's really a fascinating show from a Marxist perspective, right? Because it does bring into focus those labor chains that we don't think about, right? When we buy a hamburger, few of us are thinking about well, how many hands did this pass through? What did it take to get this made? How were the people compensated? Were they unionized, right? Oftentimes we just bite into the hamburger. We're not thinking about that. But this show, in a way, I don't think it's intentional, but it's somewhat subversive in a way because it really lays bare these labor chains that we often don't think about.
I want to talk about these makeover shows. I remember years ago
Yes.
watching, I think it's called was it Swan or Black Swan or no, wait, what was it called?
The Swan,
Yeah.
the one where they get the plastic surgery.
Yes. And I remember the first time I saw that show, I thought, I don't think their relationships are going to last after this show. I have a feeling that after the person gets all of this work and then they go back, that the relationship dynamic is not going to be the same, their life partner or their marriage. But you say that these makeover shows, quote unquote, fix to sustain social class hierarchies. So what is the relationship between fixing somebody up and the social class hierarchy?
Well, it's interesting actually that you mentioned that show. I was just talking I'm trying to remember who it was, but I was just talking to someone who recently interviewed former contestants on The Swan. And interestingly, they seem to have been happy with their time on The Swan, no regrets, which I find hard to believe, but it's kind of interesting. So I think these ideas of these makeover shows, and I'm not the first to say this, other people I cite in my book have said this too, but kind of play into hierarchies, not only of, class, but also of race, where the kind of ideal appearance is a very middle to upper middle class, white, conventionally attractive, which often means physically fit looking / thin appearance. And, people who are outside of that are seen as lesser than.
Yeah, there's a social capital to your appearance.
Oh yeah, absolutely. So it like oftentimes, right, it stems from the social, like, are you able to afford, healthful food? Are you able to afford a gym to go to? Do you have the leisure time to be able to work out? Can you fix your teeth? Can you get medical care? All of these things, these constraints that are very real, but then we kind of put people who are able to do those things, people with the money, the capital to be able to do those things, into kind of a higher echelon than people who aren't.
That's so interesting. The way that we look at people just by their appearance, it's showing us what they can afford to have done. And that also immediately lets us know what class and how you function in society. Doesn't have to do with the talent, family, love, nurturing. As soon as you see that they were able to afford the work done or the ability to be in shape, that starts to navigate how we place them in society, how successful they are.
It's true. Although then there's, right, you could tip over the edge of normalcy and become deviant, right? Where if someone gets too much plastic surgery, then they become these like objects of ridicule.
Mm.
So there is kind of a fine line. But I do think so I write about this in the book in relation to Honey Boo
Hmm.
Boo. And so that oftentimes in kind of news articles surrounding the show and the popular press, their kind of body size was alluded to, or just, outright talked about, which is really interesting. And oftentimes, especially in the United States, we tell very individualistic narratives about that, right? If your body looks a certain way, then that's because of something you're doing, that's your fault. And we even tell very moralistic narratives about that, when in actuality, there are all these social factors at work that I just talked about.
Reading your book was making me think about The Truman Show. I remember when I saw that in the theater, I actually saw it twice, and then I ended up buying the movie. And it seems to, even though it's a fiction, but it was on the cusp of MTV's work and talking about reality TV. And it does seem to illustrate this tension between what you're saying in sociology, of the study of groups and that impact versus the individual. And at the end of The Truman Show, we praise that the individual was able to triumph over that setting. But it was so fascinating to watch how this setting was all about this person's life was just for the entertainment value and all of the pressure in order to keep him on camera. But he was true in the end. The one thing that was true was himself. Do we have that in reality TV? Like, even though we know that it's staged, there's casting calls, what is the truth? Because there has to be some negative truth in there in order for us to be engaged. So I'm trying to figure out, what is the true thing that we are seeing?
Yeah, I think it's interesting to think about the Truman Show too, because in the end, wasn't it like heterosexual romantic love that triumphed over all?
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
He broke out because he wanted to be with the woman that he had been, kept apart from. So that's interesting too. But what is the truth? Yeah, this is a question I often get asked about reality TV. How is it? Is it real? Is it not? Or just oftentimes people just saying, that it's not real, right? Like, I've never heard that before.
Hmm.
Like, clearly it's not, or at this point in time, reality TV has been on long. I don't think anyone is looking at it and saying this is 100% real, just a pure mirror of reality, right? Like, we know whether or not there is like actual scripting, like they're reading off the script, which seldom happens, although sometimes happens, right? They have storylines for each season, right? These shows are cut and curated. They're cast to fill particular archetypes, as we talked about, right? Like, they're pride with psychological manipulation. Like, obviously there's a lot of unreality to reality TV. But I think at the end of the day, for me, that doesn't matter as much, because I am looking at it kind of as text. So nothing that we shape into a cultural product with our human hands can ever fully represent reality. Even a documentary, they're picking a particular story to tell and a narrative way to tell it, or even the news, right? I'm not even talking about like skewed news, like even the everyday news, they're picking who to focus on, what stories to tell. So sure, reality TV is not 100% real, and I don't know anybody who thinks that it is, but at the same time, I don't think that matters in terms of what it has to teach us about
Hmm.
ourselves. Again, like, why do we glom onto these shows? Why do we tune in? Why do we find them so fascinating? Because that fascination is real.
Yeah, I mean, in my field, I really fell in love with existentialism and existentialist literature. And and also the work of Simone de Beauvoir, and she would write about how she'd be reading philosophy and then just love the structure and the arguments. Then she would read fiction and think, wait, this is the truth. And so I am really fascinated by the truth that we get from fiction, that there is an essence, and even stuff that is nonfiction like memoir, which isn't the same thing as a historical text, but we are attracted to memoirs and biographies because we've got that truth of the human experience that we're resonating with. We want that point of view. That is the truth, is the point of view. And so I'm thinking if that's what we're getting at with the reality TV, like in the Truman Show at the end, he says, you didn't have a camera in my head. And so even though all of the manipulation, we're still fascinated because there is that truth of human experience or watching somebody go through an experience. And it's that we can't help but watch how they're going to react or what they say.
I mean, they have agency, right? They're not just robots being, remote controlled, right? They have agency within those social constraints, just as we all do. None of us have 100% agency over our lives are shaped, right, by like social class and race and gender and obligations to others, right? And the historical period in which we live and its meanings. So, and yes, within those constraints, we can, we have certain agency, but we're dealt a certain hand and then we decide how to play that hand. So I think that's similar to reality TV.
So as a sociologist, if we trace, let's say from dating shows from like the 1950s to where we are now with like MILF Manor, what
is that where we are now? I guess so.
That was my latest. That's my confession. And you know what? I'm going to blame. I have friends who have another podcast that is just genius and I love it. And they were talking about the show called MILF Manor. And so I was like, okay, well, I just got to see what is this about. And then I turned it on and I was just so shocked and appalled and I couldn't believe what I was watching. And then again, I couldn't stop watching it because I was just so appalled that this was allowed. Who thought of this as an idea? So that's where I am. But if reality show is revealing who we are, then from your point of view, what can we see about the trajectory of our culture from those early dating shows to now? What have you seen as a shift in the way we see the world, or an important shift?
I mean, it's interesting, again, because as a sociologist, I often look at stasis, right, rather than trajectory. So I often look at how things have remained the same over. And I think oftentimes we like to think about our lives in terms of trajectories or history in terms of trajectories, right? We're moving towards something or we're moving away from something. And I think in reality, there's like a lot more noise to it. So reality TV, like people will say reality TV has gotten zanier and zanier and it's zany today, but it was also zany in the early 2000s. So I don't know if it's necessarily gotten zanier, but I do think the way that it's remained the same is almost more revealing than the ways in which it's changed, right? The fact that like The Bachelor is still out there promoting those gender stereotypes. We still have shows where, women of color really fall into those stereotypical categories. We're still privileging on these dating shows. We're still privileging marriage as like that brass ring, that gold standard. So to me, that's interesting and almost more interesting than how it's changed. Although I do think, especially with post-Me Too, post-George Floyd, I do think networks are becoming more wary about how these matters are being treated on these shows. Whether that's going to be a trajectory, whether that's going to be a long-term shift, I don't know. But I do think it's an interesting time to be on reality TV. And I do think there's more that kind of fourth wall dropping now on reality TV where the show becomes part of the show itself. And oftentimes it's like social commentary on Real Housewives of Potomac. They talk about how like there was a big fight that happened. These are women of color. And they talk about how like this is not good representation to have like a fight like this happening on our kinds of show. Where really the fourth wall is coming down. They're saying we don't want to be a party to this like poor representation of people of our race and gender. So I'm seeing that more and more. I mean, also, social media has been a huge, reality TV is interesting because it's always kind of functioned on multiple platforms. You can watch the show, but then you can also like listen to the music that's being advertised on the show. We could do that since The Real World in the early 1990s. But with social media, you really can connect with the people on the show or connect, quote unquote, with them in multiple ways, right? So you watch the show and then you buy their makeup and you follow them on Instagram and you can tweet at them and maybe they'll tweet back. And so this sense that we have ownership over these people or a connection with these people, I do think has become stronger over time with the kind of advent and proliferation of social
You're
media.
right. That was one of the features that you mentioned I thought was so fascinating. It was the ability to interact with the show, like with American Idol, to be able to vote in. That was another draw. It's genius marketing, but it is why we're invested. It's because it's
Right.
calling for us to be invested.
And even shows not like that, right? Like something like the Kardashians, where, you're not literally voting on the outcome, but you can go into online message boards and register your, distaste about what's happening with Courtney, or, go and buy, Kim's video game or one of their like millions of products. It's interesting because I think people see reality TV watching as a very passive experience. And it can be, right? Like we just want something to just wash over us. We don't want to think too deeply about it. And that's true. But at the same time, it gives us this opportunity to engage kind of a lot more deeply than we do with scripted TV.
One other thing that I thought really caught my attention, and I know I'm going to ruffle feathers with my more conservative leaning friends, but you say this exposes the myth of meritocracy. Your examples, they really hit me about how these shows will show, like, let's say people who are very wealthy, the leg up that they have in the first place. And then as opposed to, was it Honey Boo Boo? That's a show I didn't watch, but I'm familiar with it, where there is this struggle that people who've quote unquote made it, these shows reveal that all of the networking and the finances behind it to make it possible, that there's more to life than just merit, that you just got to work your way to the top. These reality shows are showing us that people who, they do have to work, but they have also got a huge foundation of wealth and opportunity.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, but then we tell, right, these narratives about meritocracy. So again, people look at a show like Honey Boo Boo, and you look at like, like working class family. People will say they're being portrayed as very like slovenly, lazy. They just want to sit around all day, eat from a cheese ball jar, right? Their physical size is a part of that narrative too, right? Like, how could they be that size? They must be lazy. Again, these very like individualistic narratives that if you dig into it, really don't take into account any of, the social factors. Like, did they come from money? Are cheese balls just a lot cheaper to buy than asparagus and kale? So they really expose this sort of narrative that we tell about individualism and about meritocracy that, like, in some ways is true, right? There's always agency. In some ways we can improve our social situations, but that really don't take into account the social constraints that we're all under.
When you started working on this, is there something that you had an aha moment or something that surprised you? Like as you started to, on one level, you're enjoying this. On the next level, you're an academic. When these two worlds kind of came together, what was that moment? And then as you started looking through the evidence or, paying more attention to the shows, is there something that unfolded for you and you thought, oh my goodness?
Yeah, there was. I've been teaching this class at Lehigh where I teach about sociology of reality TV. So I knew that when I started writing this book, I wanted to sort of rely on the syllabus for that class. So every week we look at a classic text in sociology, and then we look at an episode of a reality show and we see how they converge, right? So we look at Marx, and then we talk about Undercover Boss, or we look at RuPaul's Drag Race and talk about a classic work on gender, right? You get the idea. So all that stuff I kind of knew, and I kind of knew what I wanted to say. But it was actually kind of late in the game, like after I had compiled a draft of the book, that my editor was kind of like, you know what, you seem to be saying that even though these shows are, kind of out there and outlandish, that at the heart of it, there's really this conservatism. And that was really a light bulb moment for me, because I hadn't thought about, even though I had been kind of saying that or hinting at that kind of like that kind of waist cinch to the whole book, like really brought it together. I found it really helpful to think about reality TV that way, because it is paradoxical. These shows are really out there, a lot of them, but at their core, not all of them, but a lot of them really like come back to really like conservative, narrow definitions and values. So I think that was my aha moment when my editor said that.
Okay, so since I know that you're teaching this with your students, what are the conversations like in the classroom about these reality TV shows? What are, it's a different generation, so what do they
Oh, it's
think?
so interesting. Yeah, it's like almost teaching sociology is such an interesting bellwether for, just social trends in general, just teaching young people. And I learned a lot of slang too, which is helpful. But so I've been teaching this course for about 10 years now. And at first, the students were keyed in. They would watch The Bachelor. They'd be getting together like every week to watch The Bachelor. Some of them now watch the shows, but they're more likely to say like, oh, my mom watches Real Housewives, so I'll watch with her. I don't think reality TV is becoming obsolete by any means, but it's interesting now that like, I don't know if young people are tuning into it as much as they were before. You know, they're tuning into like different forms of reality programming, like the TikToks and the YouTubes. So that's kind of interesting to me. Just anecdotally, like fewer of my students seem to be actively watching these shows in real time, though they will tell me that, you know, maybe they'll binge an entire season of Love is Blind when they have a free weekend. So that's been interesting to me. Yeah, I think it's just always interesting teaching sociology because I have students who come in with a lot of preconceived ideas about the world, and you're really like pushing it, like the myth of meritocracy, right? And you're really pushing at a lot of those ideas. Like, yes, we do all still have agency. We can pull ourselves up, but at the same time, you can't discount like all these social forces that are weighing us down. So that's an interesting conversation to have in any sociology class, much less this class, because I think the students who take this class, I think sometimes think they're just like coming in to take an easy class. Like, we'll talk about the Kardashians, it'll be fine. And then they realize they're reading Foucault and they're like, what did I sign up for? But I think at the end of the day, I mean, I love it because I take students who maybe wouldn't have taken a sociology class, and I think it gets them thinking more deeply about our social world.
Absolutely. Danielle, thank you so much. Thank you so much for your time. This has been so enjoyable. I love that I got to do a whole episode on reality TV and get out of my guilty pleasure, my confession phase, and just openly say, yes, I've seen these shows. And you know what? There's a lot to analyze here.
So much for having me on.
Good is in the Details is produced by Dr. Gwendolyn Dolske and Rudy Sallow. Remember to check out that link to vote for Good is in the Details in the womeninpodcasting.net for the education category. Also check out our Patreon. I put some new stuff up there. Patreon.com/Good is in the Details. When you go to Patreon and you support the podcast, you make it possible for us to keep on going with this content. Thank you for those of you who have already become patrons. We'd also like to thank our sponsor for this episode, AvonmoreInc.com. It's that small bridge business that started in the 90s and grew to a global international sensation amongst bridge players. So if you play bridge, or if anybody in your family or network or circle plays bridge, you got to check out AvonmoreInc.com. They have everything you need for your next bridge party. And remember, let them know Good is in the Details sent you. Okay, follow, share, all the good things. Subscribe, rate as you're listening to this podcast. Take a screenshot of this episode or your favorite episode and tag us on Instagram, Good is in the Details Pod. Okay, until next time, bye.